My name's Timothy Tate. I'm a PhD candidate here at Griffith University, and I'm joined here by Mads.
My name is Krogh. I'm an associate professor at the section for musicology and dramaturgy at Aarhus University, and I am an associate professor of public music culture. Pleased to meet you.
You too. So, a little bit about myself and my research. I look at obsolete technologies, anything from a floppy disk drive, as you can see here, which is heavily modified. And I look at them for their sonic potentials, their ability to be circuit bent, which is like a creative rewiring of them. And I have a background in classical composition, but also in DIY electronics. And I'm interested in how some of this work can feed into a compositional process and a compositional approach. Circuit bending and hardware hacking is very much an established genre, but also an established way of approaching obsolete technologies. And again, showing you the idea of short circuiting or rewiring, the notion that you are taking a piece of consumer hardware and making it do something it's not meant to do, and usually revealing its failures or revealing things that are not meant to be heard, is what really fascinates me from a compositional perspective, and how we can harness this in practice, but also harness this in more of a wider Western compositional focus.
Yeah. Perhaps I should say a bit about my research as well. I research issues of musical genre, genre theory, currently particularly in the light of digital developments. But I also have a long-term interest in musical practice, what it means to consider music form of practice, and how social and discursive and material conditions affect various kinds of musicking. And I suppose the issue of materiality is what we're here to talk about today. Issues of materiality and mediation in artistic practices, and that is something that I have looked at. I've looked at that from the perspective of music sociology, where there is, of course, a very long tradition for considering social contexts for doing music or musicking. But within the last 2 decades or so, there's been an increasing interest also in issues of materiality. And I suppose in a certain sense it's obvious that doing music has to do with instruments, artifacts, the materiality of venues. I mean, what would a musician be without his or her instrument? And so questions about what media and material artifacts or conditions mean have come increasingly to the fore. And I've been interested in that, for example, by looking at the work of hip-hop DJs, their production of beats, and how, for example, studio environments, the material arrangements, the kinds of media available in the studio affects that kind of musical practice. And I think, speaking to your work, I think it's really fascinating how engaging with instruments, with media, with material issues of music making can work as a kind of facilitator for creative work. Would you talk a bit about some of those examples, for example? I mean,
yeah. I suppose I mentioned earlier about the circuit bending and hardware hacking movement. People such as, well, artists rather, such as Christian Marclay and Nicholas Collins, both who really look at the practice of repurposing obsolete technologies. Christian Marclay is an artist, definitely an artist in his own right, but also a turntablist who takes the turntable and creates an instrument out of it through really harnessing the unwanted noises, the clicks, the pops that we try to avoid when listening to vinyl, as well as even splicing vinyl together to make clicks and pops from the spliced vinyl, but also changes in musical content as two vinyl records or more are combined. Whereas someone like Nicholas Collins is looking at, a little bit like me, the circuit and how that can be interesting from a hacking perspective, but a musical perspective as well. And I think what's really interesting in their work is that it's the celebration of the materiality of either the instrument or the consumer hardware, which has now become an instrument, but as well as the material that is being either reproduced or is allowing for audio to be reproduced.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess these are people, and perhaps that may also go for your work, who both direct attention to the media, the materiality of music, but also use that as a kind of catalyst for creative thinking, for doing artistic work.
Indeed, I mean the idea of something failing, you don't know how it will fail, you don't know what interventions you're going to be doing with it will result. Well, you don't really know the results until you actually intervene.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really interesting, especially for me. The classical side I come from is very much you have forms and you have structures that are there, but there's a lot of, in contemporary composition, experimentation, because our world is our oyster. So many things have been done and there's so many genres that we can draw from. So how do we get started? And I suppose increasingly for me it's that idea of looking at something in a circuit or looking at something I can work with outside of pen and paper, instruments, and go, well, how can this make me rethink some of the things or the notions that I'm holding on to?
Yeah. And I suppose also opening up those media which are so often opaque, so often hidden behind a smooth surface of functionality.
Indeed, yes. I mean, as I think increasingly as we are in a digital age, things are hidden.
Yeah.
And they're hidden, but they're very complex. You go back to the gramophone, and it's very much an object that is being played.
Yeah.
The record is being played. You can see how it's working. You can see some of the interesting technology in a CD player, but increasingly it's being veiled behind shiny cases, and in the case now, devices.
Yeah, sure. It reminds me a bit about a case study I did of a Danish DJ. I was looking at his studio, his beat production, and how he relied, obviously, on his studio. And I thought there was a very interesting doubleness in how he at least talked about, and I suppose also acted within the studio. On the one hand, he was very conscious about how the studio should facilitate his work as almost a kind of, transparent medium for his doing or for his ideas. So nothing should get in the way. If something didn't work or got in the way, then he couldn't do his thing. But on the other hand, it was also quite obvious that a lot of the stuff that he surrounded himself with were actually taking a fairly active part in what he was doing. So he had his record rack in the studio, his collections, his collection of vinyl records, and that worked also almost as a kind of a tool for finding inspiration. He would browse it as a kind of archive of images, of snippets of text from song titles, of associations for other artists and their work, and of course for samples. I mean, it was a way of browsing an archive of sound, basically, of music which could be sampled and used as a starting point for constructing a beat, but also as a kind of impetus for creative ideas. And then of course he had he had a digital audio workstation that he used, and it was quite obvious that that came with other affordances, other ways of facilitating his work. So basically, it allowed him to cut and combine samples in certain ways, and in that respect, of course, that original impetus of inspiration from the sample or perhaps from the record rack that was sort of transformed. But then, as a kind of third condition, he also had a wider range of arrangement. He had decorated his studio with hip-hop memorabilia, with his own work, with posters and flyers, and the way he talked about that was almost as a kind of framing for that creative process of transforming samples into beats, a kind of framing, maintaining a constant sense of what he regarded as real hip-hop. So it almost worked as kind of an exemplar for how a well-working hip-hop beat should be. And in that sense, his studio really transformed what was going on, I think. It transformed his inspiration. It certainly engaged in what he was doing. It played almost, I would say, an active role in the creative act. And I think actually that doubleness of, on the one hand, a certain notion of transparency, of media transporting or transferring something, in this case his work basically, but on the other hand, of course, also the fact that media transform, distort what they convey or what they transfer. I think that's a very basic lesson here, and one that's worth keeping in mind.
Definitely. I mean, even that idea from just having that media there that you can browse and have, you can touch, you can also smell. Yeah. It does kind of have that a way to really inspire and really give, I suppose, a directional kind of starting point, really. Yeah. In which you can then allow the tools that you have around you or you've created to kind of mold that media, or transform it or recontextualize it. And that's, I suppose, what I really like about the physical media that I work with, is that it can be transformed. But I also like the idea that something like a CD player, it digitizes this, and that's where we can start really playing with the digital. And that's a post-digital work or framework in which I like to work within. But that idea or aesthetic of failure, the failure of the digitization or the failure of the reproduction of the digital sort of encoded audio, is what's kind of really interesting from that point for me. And I suppose in your example of that Danish artist, that process of digitizing as well, there's other affordances of that software and decisions that have been made by the software designers, and of course the way that he uses it, compared to how other artists would be using it, is also kind of impacting upon the creative decisions that are being made.
Yeah, certainly. I think perhaps that tactility, this sensual closeness of physical media, that is often quite important. But of course, I mean, if you know how to open up digital media or online platforms or software, then you can also access that, and it may come with a similar kind of affordance of creative work or an impetus for getting ideas for doing artistic work. I think though that sometimes with the way digital media have spread, and today often in online versions where things have moved up into the cloud, and I think sometimes there is a kind of distance in that digitization, which perhaps raises an extra challenge, so to say. I mean, I think it's a very basic thing about media that we often expect that with media developments things get more rational, they get more efficient, they get more well-functioning. And I think that's also the case with the move we have sort of made into a thoroughly digitized world, also in terms of music making. And perhaps that raises extra challenges today for using the mediality, for using mediality as a kind of catalyst for creative inspiration and work.
Yeah, definitely. I think the digital world is incredible in the sense that so much can be done by a computer, and so much can be done and afforded by a cloud-based working environment, not only in a collaborative way, but also in an accessibility way. You can disseminate your music to so many different people now, but that also raises questions of kind of how you are working with that technology, and whether that is also impacting you outside of the work you do. That studio is now kind of almost broadcast to the entire world.
Yeah.
And does that play a part now in how one works or thinks about making choices in that domain?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of belief in digital media. I've been talking to users of digital platforms, and often I find that they really have a lot of belief in the efficiency of algorithms, of the kind of software developed for sorting music and for accessing it, for distributing it in various ways, and I mean, they have a lot of faith in this, even to the point where they start finding reasons for why they experience that sometimes doesn't work. I mean, it's not to do with the platform, it's the way it's used or access, or there are other conditions around it. But I think that just speaks to that notions of media development as connected to increasing efficiency and increasing degrees of, kind of rationalized functionality. And I suppose in that sense it takes some digital literacy, some amount of computational thinking, perhaps some reminding that digital platforms of course exist or are used in environments which are also material, to sort of hang on to a more open sense of what can be done.
And I think even just thinking about now the materiality of streaming services, we think you buy a modern car now and you won't have a CD player. You probably won't have a CD player. It will all be Bluetooth connectivity, or you're going to be connecting your device, and it becomes the device now which is the thing that is allowing you to access this music, whether or not you're buying it or whether you're streaming it. It's very much based upon the device that you carry, rather than the actual media itself.
Yeah. Yeah, at least I think some of the formats for distributing music, they're sort of hidden behind the devices.
Yes.
So we have very smooth interfaces for what we can do. But of course, I mean, they may still perhaps be opened up.
So I guess what we've been talking about here really is the ideas of materiality or immateriality, and how they're continuing to really affect artists today.
Yeah, and I suppose it speaks to the basic condition of mediation as an aspect of musical practices.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.